Okay, here we go. All right, good evening. I'm Ed Sterling. I have been a stamp collector since I was a child. I received a box one day on a summer day in probably 1961 with a box of stamps sent from an aunt who would comb thrift stores, and that got me started on collecting stamps. I was totally enamored with triangles from Africa and big bugs, and one stamp from Germany that was upside down, the other one was right side up, attached together, and that apparently was normal. So it became an interesting hobby for me. I wish I had some of the money I'd spent as a kid on stamps to come back again. So tonight I wanted to talk about the famous, infamous, upside down airmail stamp, sometimes known as the inverted Jenny, and to stamp collectors, what's known as Scott C3A. So Scott is a company that catalogs all the stamps in the world and by country, and they assign a number, and typically a suffix of A means there's something wrong, there's something special, if something is misprinted or inverted. And so C3 indicates that this was supposedly the third airmail stamp, and in fact it was the first. So Scott kind of misnumbered them, and the A indicates that it was inverted. So that's where we get the various ways to refer to this particular stamp that was printed in 1918. It's probably the most famous stamp error, if not the most famous stamp in the US collection. And so the question is, who would have discovered this? And where do we get this name Jenny? And so it turns out that there's a very interesting book, the title is inverted somewhat appropriately, called Jenny, The Exciting History of the World's Best Known Stamp Error by George Amick, and all the details are in there. Could airplanes possibly fly the mail? Well, the Wright brothers fly in December of 1903. For 10 years there was discussion about flying mail in airplanes, these very rudimentary flying machines. There was an experiment in 1911 to see if mail could be handled with an airplane in New York City on Long Island.
I grew up right next to Garden City.
Oh, well, there you go. And so that's quite the airplane. It looks like bicycle wheels and a kite with a motor on it. And this fellow is receiving a bag of mail to actually go and fly it to a place where he's going to drop it, to a remote post office. So it was a bit of an experiment at the time in 1911. And so the pilot was Earl Ovington. And that's a pretty brave flyer to fly in something like that. In 1912, the post office issued beautiful Parcel Post stamps. I don't think there's been anything as beautiful as the engraving and the art that they did. And so of a whole series from 1 cent to $1 to use on Parcel Post, which was a new innovation. The 20 cent says airplane carrying mail, but in fact it's a fantasy. That plane did not carry mail. In fact, the whole picture is a fantasy by an artist just to make a pretty stamp. There was no mail being carried by an airplane like that. All right? It was an idea that would come to pass in time. And again, it's 6 years before actual airmail started. So the war starts, World War I starts in 1914, the US gets dragged into it, and there was a decision that airplanes are sophisticated enough now, and there could be good reason to have mail carried by airplanes. And the airplanes are sophisticated enough to carry a cargo load. There's pilots being trained for the Air Force, if you will, or the Air Service, the US Army. And they had been trying for 10 years to do something like this. And finally, $100,000 was allocated to begin to experiment with the notion of airmail. And they decided that the US Army would supply the pilots and the airplanes, since the Postal Service did not have its own. They decided to modify a training biplane called the Curtiss JN. And they went through a whole bunch of different modifications of this large lumbering biplane that was used for training. It couldn't dogfight, it didn't have the maneuverability to go up against the Germans. So it was never sent over to Europe as a viable fighter. But it was a good trainer, had a large wingspan, and was pretty forgiving to young pilots. It just had arbitrarily this JN4 designation, and that nickname turned into Jenny when it was being referred to. HM indicates that it was modified to carry a big mail bag, instead of a second pilot in the cockpit. And so there's two examples of Jenny airplanes, big engines. They were sold for cheap money after the war as for barnstormers, but it was a good way to start the air service and not rob the air service of fighter planes by using these trainers, and we had enough of them to do that. So 38262 turns out to be the serial number of the airplane that we see on the stamp itself. That particular plane was chosen by the artist to engrave onto the stamp to become the famous 24-cent airmail. 3 stamps were envisioned, and oddly enough, the 24-cent was the very first. But the way the Scott Catalog Company looked at it, they went by the numerical designation. So, in fact, the 6-cent airmail was the latest one. The 16-cent was done in the summer, and the first one was the 24-cent. And that was quite a lot of money. That might have been like $5 today if you were to look at the same equivalency of value of money. Right? And so you can see the prices declining as they increase the airmail service and they learn a little bit more about how to do it efficiently. The idea was that this very first stamp would be chosen with patriotic colors, red, white, and blue. That was a trick in those days because the printing machinery was somewhat primitive, and they really had only done monochrome stamps of different colors over the years. So this was really one of the first attempts to have a bicolor stamp and involved some complications in printing it. Because it was a special stamp of limited production, there wasn't that much call for airmail at the moment. They didn't want to interrupt the major printing presses at the Printing and Engraving Bureau. And so they got out some old, what they call spider printing presses. And that's what it looked like. That great big wheel, if you will, was used to manually press down hard on the inked rollers and the frame that contained the design of the stamps. And so you would ink the frame, you had your paper slide in, and then the roller would be pulled. It looks a bit like a spider, I suppose, and that would print that particular color of 100 stamps at a time. And we have a picture of the room. There's the employees at the printing press with all their spider presses producing a lot of airmail stamps. Very slowly, one sheet at a time. Okay? Obviously nothing automated at that point. These are what's called the proofs. So as the stamp was being made, the engraver had to produce a frame set and a biplane set. And then by printing it twice and overlaying one color on the other, you got the result of the bicolor red, white, and blue airmail stamp. And so these are the proofs as they were ready for printing at the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. So because it was used for primarily banknotes, they were using this short paper, this 100 stamp sheets, where normally stamps were printed 400 at a time. And that led to a lot of confusion. The thought was that normally you would print a larger sheet of 400 and you'd cut it up into 4 pieces, and then that would go out to the different post offices for sale. But in this case, this spider press couldn't do that. It could only do one sheet of 100 at a time. And that becomes rather important as the story develops. It clearly had to be a physical handling error. The thought was that perhaps the blue plane was printed first, and someone got distracted and inverted the sheet. And in a big stack, suddenly there's one that's going the wrong direction. And as they printed it, apparently nobody seemed to notice. Now, after the word got out that there was an inverted sheet sold to the public, they went back into their stocks, and different sources say they found 3, other sources say they found 8 of these misprinted sheets. And of course they had to be destroyed because the post office didn't want errors like this floating around. Right? And so out of 22,000 sheets, only one, the famous one that our story is about, escaped detection. Again, the sheet had to be realigned because you're handling ink plates you're wetting them down with blue ink, clearing them, revolving the big wheel, printing the sheet with the paper, undoing it, taking the sheet, letting it off to dry, and getting the next sheet in. And so it turns out that there were what they call high planes and fast planes on the regular sheets that were not aligned properly. And you can see the grounded plane is way down too far because it wasn't aligned quite right in the printing press. And then a fast plane means it's sort of flying off the stamp because, again, it wasn't aligned properly in that direction. So there was a lot of mishandling, but these get a nominal increase in value, but they're nothing like the inverted stamp itself. You've got a stamp, you've got pilots, you've got a plane, you've got a Jenny plane. Let's fly some airmail. And they decided on May 15th to have the first airmail flight from Washington to Philadelphia and then Philadelphia to New York as a skip, if you will. And so that first pilot took off in the old 38-262, the one that we see on the stamp, and immediately heads the wrong way. He starts going south instead of going up to Philadelphia. He follows the wrong railroad tracks, and he basically goes the wrong way, and he crashes the plane. He was given a second chance. He did the same thing. He got lost. He started going south. He crashed the plane. Right? So he was relieved of duty. He was chosen as the pilot, much to the objection of the senior Air Force, if you will, or Army Air Service brass, because he was the son-in-law of the Interstate Commerce Commission's daughter. So there was a little bit of favoritism there. So he wasn't the best pilot. He was the most prominent. And these are examples of what we call first day covers. They show May 14th. They show the regular stamp, of course. And they're just examples of things that collectors like to find. The very first use of a stamp as postmarked. And first day covers today, they get very fancy. They have special envelopes that say first day of service, and it makes for a nice souvenir, but generally they aren't worth that much. Something like this is worth a lot because it truly is, predates these fancy covers. Collectors aren't really collecting them that much, and it would seem to be a little boring just to get the first day, but later on it becomes a rather interesting hobby to collect first day covers. And we get a second one here with a special sticker. All right, and that was May 15th. So you've got stamps, you've got pilots, the right pilots who can fly. You've got the Army is helping the Post Office service with airmail. And so indeed, what could go wrong? Well, at this point, we have a character entering the picture, Mr. William T. Roby. He was a clerk at a stock brokerage firm in Washington, D.C. He was a very avid stamp collector. And he was the lucky fellow that purchased the sheet, the one sheet of the upside-down airplane stamps. And so was he just a nobody? The answer is not quite. He was a very avid stamp collector and had an inkling something like this was going to happen. Right. And there he is in 1918. He was very dedicated to his hobby. He worked at a brokerage, 29 years old, married, lived in an apartment. He read stamp collecting newspapers in the day. He was very well informed of what was going on. He heard about this 24-cent airmail stamp that was going to occur, and would write to friends about, you know, I've seen this and I've seen that, and I hear they're going to produce this two-color stamp. We all should be looking out for it. And he was certain that this two-color printing process was going to lead to problems. And the reason was that in 1901, there were some very beautiful stamps to celebrate the Pan American Exposition, and a number of those came out inverted, and they're worth quite a lot of money. But in time, there were enough of those that they don't quite get the same value as the inverted airplane stamp. Right? So he wrote to friends. He said, I think we're going to see some inverts like those 1901s. So everybody keep your eye out. Okay, I'm definitely going to be looking myself. And there's the inverts that today are worth, probably $30,000. Depending upon the quality and the condition. Right. These are things collectors certainly look out for. So he's on the hunt, and he's certain that something's going to happen. This is like going out to buy the winning lottery ticket. There was some thought that maybe the stamps were going to go on sale on May 13th. They did not seem to. It was really May 14th. So the post office may have had the stamps in their drawers ready for sale the next day. That seems to be the case. And he goes to the bank and he withdraws $30. And apparently that would have been 1 month's rent in those days. So that was a bit of a gamble to buy a set of stamps for 1 month's rent. And the sheet would have cost $24. It was a 24-cent stamp, and they printed them 10 by 10. Right? And he goes early and he looks at some of the sheets, and again, some of them are kind of misaligned, and he's not very happy with the quality of the printing, and of course he doesn't see anything inverted. So he apparently asks for a couple of them, and the clerk goes along with it, and he says, no, I don't want them, I'll come back later. And he goes to a different post office, as I recall. So he takes a lunch break at noon, and he goes to this post office in Washington, and I guess he got a couple of sheets and looked at one, and by God, he said it was inverted. And his quote was, "My heart stood still." This is exactly what he was hoping for, that he would find one of these famous inverted sheets. So he quickly purchases it with his $24, and then asks for the clerk to check and see if there's any more. He says, like the one you just sold me with the upside down. And apparently the clerk suddenly realizes that this inverted sheet has gotten out of his hands, the clerk's hands, and goes, give me that back. And this is what he would have seen. This is an interesting reprint that's for sale on eBay at the moment of someone who has apparently taken the time to print these on their own. I don't know how, but this one is $95, and some other ones have seem to be for sale in the several $100s if you wanted a genuine sort of souvenir of it. But this is what Roby would have had in his hands, minus, of course, the indicator markings, with the plate number in the lower corner. Let's see if it'll do it. I don't know. Let's see if we get it. There we go. It says 8493, and it's the plate number that was, again, inverted. Okay, so it's seems to be the blue one upside down. So this is what he would have had in his hands. And let's see if we can get that. So the clerk gets a glimpse of this sheet and yells, give me that back. He runs away, and they immediately close the window and stop the sale of the 24-cent stamps. Right? And the clerk gets on the phone and calls up the Central Post Office Authority, probably at the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, and says, somebody got an invert and I couldn't stop him. So he goes back to work and starts bragging about it to all his other friends, many of which apparently were also stamp collectors. And very aggressively, he starts sending out telegrams to dealers looking for somebody to buy this. Right? Because he doesn't know if this is the only sheet that was ever printed upside down. No one has any idea. There could be hundreds. So his friends rush out, and it must have been a bad day at the brokerage, to go to the post office to see if they can find some upside down sheets. Right? And so for him, it's kind of a hot potato. And he goes to a stamp dealer called Hamilton Coleman, and later on in the day, Coleman calls him and said, what did you want? He says, I've got the upside down airplane stamps. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll give you $500 for it. And he felt very insulted with that and refused the offer. Right? And again, remember that we talked about these sheets being printed in batches of 100 sheets size. Dealers would have thought they were 400 sheets, the normal one. And so there must be 3 others. So maybe Roby does not have that one single sheet. And so everybody thinks there must be 3 more out there. There has to be. Even if that's the only sheet, it must have been the only sheet of 400. So there must be 3 others, and everybody kept waiting for that to appear, and it never happened, because then later on they realized they were not printed in the usual way. And again, we said that somewhere between 3 to 8 of these sheets were found at the post office and summarily destroyed. So inspectors at the post office start asking around, and I guess they hang around the post office when these friends come in, and they're asking questions. So, you got a friend who found an upside down? Oh yeah, this guy told me about the upside down sheet. And so they got a name, and they go to work at his brokerage, and he won't give it back. and I guess they're really giving him a workover. He didn't get arrested, but I guess there wasn't quite a crime, but they certainly wanted this error sheet back. Well, he wouldn't give it. And they go to his home. He isn't there toward the end of the day. And he literally wanders around Washington until 9 o'clock at night, waiting for the agents to get tired so he can come home with his briefcase that has the stamps in it. Again, he's certain that the post office heat is on. How long can he avoid it? Are they in fact going to collar him at some point and force it out of him? And so he's calling people as quick as he can. He's calling all these famous stamp dealers that he's dealt with. Elliot Perry was a fellow who he'd done a lot of business with. And he tells Perry about it. And Perry says, well, I don't know. I'm not sure. How much do you want? And so some negotiation back and forth. And Perry says, I'm not sure how much I want to pay, but give me a right of first refusal. And he writes this letter with $1 in it and says, this signifies my legal offer. And the answer is for what? It had nothing. So it was a useless piece of paper, and Roby refused to deal with him on that. And there's a note from Roby to Perry saying, did you get my telegram? I have the sheet of 100 with the upside down airplane. And this letter alone was sold for $57,000. Remarkable, isn't it? Anything associated with the airplane stamp is something. So this is the option where he says, I'm enclosing a dollar bill, and here's the serial number, and that gives me the right to a first refusal somewhere. And it's like, no, it's not. So Roby pays no attention to it. So another fellow named Percy Mann, who again is a publisher of Stamp News, is another gentleman that he contacts. And so Percy Mann says, I'll give you $10,000 for that. Now again, that's a fortune. In 1918, I mean, that would probably be like, again, $200,000 at least today. And again, Roby he's on a tightrope. You know, this is the find of a lifetime, and yet how much does he push? And I guess he didn't feel 10,000 was enough. So again, now he's giving Mann the right to outbid, but he still thinks there's something more to be had. And he thinks, maybe if I went to New York City, there's more money up there than there is in Washington. So sure enough, he takes the night train, and he arrives at 9 o'clock, and he meets a couple of these stamp dealers up there. And I guess he shows him the sheet, and he says that this guy, Mann, has offered $10,000. Well, you know, we're not sure that we want to offer anything to beat that one. So they depart. They think that maybe they can get an agreement somehow, but not that night. And so Roby keeps hoping that there's something more at the well. So the next morning in New York City, he tries to contact Colonel Greene. Who is Colonel Greene? Well, it turns out he's an extremely wealthy individual. All right? He's the son of a woman named Hedy Greene, a famous financier on Wall Street, literally the most richest woman on Wall Street ever in those days. She was known as the Witch of Wall Street because she was extremely miserly. She wore rags. She smelled bad. She didn't seem to bathe. She ate a cold oatmeal, is the story. Anything to minimize the amount of money that she would spend in her life on anything. And she's so stingy, Edward, her son, gets an infection in his leg, and she won't even go to a doctor. It costs too much money, but she had millions. And this poor kid's leg gets amputated because of the gangrene that she refuses to have treated properly. Well, she left a $150 million fortune, and Edward inherited half of it. So he had plenty of money to spend on his different hobbies. So Colonel Greene would have been a good fellow to contact if you were looking for money for your upside-down plane stamps. Colonel Greene isn't in. So he's, again, wandering around New York City, going to these famous stamp companies. Stanley Gibbons, a well-known name in stamp collecting even today. They only want to give him $250. He goes to Scott, the folks that have the cataloging system. No offer at all, no interest. He goes to a fellow at Nassau Stamps, another famous New York company in the stamp business. Same story, $2,500. So now he's wondering maybe he passed up the best offer of $10,000, and is it getting too late? So now he's making calls back. He says, I haven't gotten an offer beyond $10,000. And then he plays a bluff and says, well, you know, I wanted more than that, but I'll just keep it for myself for now. And so he decides not to let Mann in on the deal. But Mann has another friend named Klein, and they really want to meet him. And he says, well, I'm going to go home. And they said, no. Stop in Philadelphia on your way back. We have to talk to you about this. And so at that meeting, Klein says, all right, name your price. And Roby blurts out $15,000. All right? And so Klein says, I think I can do that, but give me an option until 3 o'clock the next day. And so Roby agrees to that. So he goes home and he keeps waiting for a telegram to come in. Will Klein be the actual buyer with the $15,000? And sure enough, a registered letter arrived on Monday morning from Klein. He says, I will buy the stamp from you. Okay, the set. Now, this fellow Coleman, the very first guy that he contacted, who gave him $500 offer, now is coming with his tail between his legs going, I'll give you 18. Right? Well, Roby was insulted by that original offer, and he decides, no, I made a deal with Klein last night, and I'm going to do the deed for $15,000. And so it's sold. And he meets Klein, and they exchange the sheet for $15,000. So there's Klein on the left, and there's the famous Colonel Greene that he was hoping to meet, the multi-millionaire, who become part of the next chapter in the story. So Colonel Greene does show up, and he's got more money than you can imagine, and they've done business together. And he owns this beautiful estate in Round Hill in Rhode Island. I believe that's where it is. And there he is. There's the Colonel in his touring car with his wife, Mabel. And it turns out that Klein had made an advance deal. Even though he didn't own the stamp, he contacted Colonel Greene himself and said, I've got a sheet of inverted airmail stamps that I'll sell for $20,000. And the Colonel, who is pocket change, says, I'd love to buy those. $20,000 it is. So he actually sold the sheet that he didn't own, but luckily for him, the deal was done. And so he made $5,000 from his price to Roby to what Colonel Greene paid Klein. So not bad. So Greene becomes the owner, but he trusts Klein to deal with the sheet, to dispose of it in a very efficient way. And so Klein becomes the agent for this amazing set. The whole sheet becomes numbered. Klein takes a pencil and very lightly writes on the back of every stamp a number. So we have Klein to thank for identifying every known 100 of the 100 stamps, and that's how they're traceable today. And so when you have an auction, it will say Klein number is 79, Klein number is 58, all right? And so you know exactly where it is on the sheet and what you're buying. So again, we can thank Klein for doing that. All right? So the Colonel says, look, split it up, let's make money. I want some of these, and let's make some blocks of 8 and 4. Give me some in the middle, give me some on the tabs and so on. And the Colonel takes 41 of them. And he actually has a locket made for his wife, Mabel. And there it is. So she wore that around her neck, almost like a little magnifier in the middle. Looks as if there were 2 of them, frankly. But that was nothing to the Colonel. So I call this a logical stopping point in the sense that you could go on and on for hours talking about how every single stamp was sold, all right? And there's a book that actually does that. It's called The Stamp of the Century. And so pretty much every sale has been documented in this book, probably to a laborious end, if you will. So thousands of dollars, millions of dollars were made on the sale of these different blocks and individual stamps as they have been sold by dealers from roughly about 1937, I think it was, to even to today. So the stamps are still trading. Right? This is what they look like today if you put all the known pictures of them and a few that are missing here and there. Some have literally been never found. They went to different collectors who have never decided to share their stamp with any authorities and offer a photo of it or where it is today. And again, I think one is missing. It was stolen and still has not been found. Right? But everything else has been accounted for in some way, shape, or fashion. What happened to Roby? Well, he got $15,000, which again was a fortune in those days. He was living in an apartment, again with $30 a month rent, so they buy a nice house in Washington, D.C. They get a car. But then sadly, their child, the first child, gets polio, and he spends quite a lot of money on treatments for the child. Over time, the money disappears apparently. He has trouble paying his debts. He changes jobs at a different brokerage. His wife has to work. They have a second child who dies young. And so life was not that good to Roby after this amazing find. And he dies in 1949. And there he is, pretty late in life, 1938. Did not make a big fuss about it, was not a celebrity hound on the stamps. It probably was a bit of a burden for him, frankly. Okay. How about Colonel Greene? Well, he had millions. He had 41 of the stamps. He stored them rather poorly. Apparently a number of them got stuck together in his safe, with moisture. Probably had to be steamed off. That typically happens when you have stamps that get stuck. And he dies in 1936. He had quite a big collection of everything. And so 28 different auctions occurred, thanks to Klein. And 38 Jennies were sold off in those auctions. Early on, I think they were selling for like $150, very early on. And then, of course, they went into thousands and eventually into millions. Okay. Percy Mann, the fellow who made the original offer that was rejected and had the stamp news, he dies penniless after apparently investing in bad Liberty bonds. I don't know how you do that, because I thought those were government backed, but they may not have been. So he lost money and died penniless, which is remarkable for a man who had a chance to buy the stamps. So Klein really made out well. He made, again, an instant $5,000 selling it to Greene. He then made, obviously, commissions in selling the sheets, different stamps for the Colonel. He gets a lot of prominent positions in the stamp collecting world, American Philatelic Society, president, secretary, and so on, and dies during the war. Everything was broken up again into the different numbers. One of the most valuable is called the inverted plate, where we have that upside down number of 8493. And those are the positions, 87, 88, 97, 98. And that was the only one with that number on it. So that was quite an attractive thing for someone who had the money. So it was sold for $2.97 million to a big financier on Wall Street named Bill Gross. I think he had a hedge fund. He then swaps it, oddly enough, for an 1868 1-cent stamp that had some type of a special, what they call grill, the way the stamp was printed on the back. And as a result, he has the only complete collection of all U.S. stamps of every type, which is surprising, isn't it? And that it was worth that to him to trade that. I think it's remarkable, because I think the block of 4 is so beautiful. And that's what he bought, 2.97. But it gets better. It gets better. That then sells again to another fellow, Stuart Weitzman, 4.9 million. Little block of stamps. And the price went down a little bit. Weitzman finally got tired of that, and he sold it to Sotheby's auction house for 4.86. So a little bit of money was lost on that to a fellow in the Carlyle Financial Group. So that's where we sit right now for just that block of 4. Most of the other stamps seem to go anywhere from, say, $250,000 for one in kind of average condition, and may have been rather poorly handled, to probably $500,000 on average for a typical stamp. Some of them that are in just perfect condition, beautifully centered, very well torn, if you will, as they were broken apart. Something like that might fetch $1 million. Okay. I know when I was a kid, I looked in a stamp catalog in about 1963, and the suggested price was $10,000 at that point. So everything's relative. Okay. Interestingly, the U.S. Post Office thought they'd capitalize on this famous inverted Jenny, and they decided to reprint the stamp upside down, but with a new designation of $2 to make it a more appropriate value, if you will. Obviously, they wouldn't print 24 again, so they don't want counterfeits, and there's plenty of counterfeits out there you can buy on eBay for $5. So they print a block of 6 stamps with a $2 designation, and they were sold in what they call a special souvenir sheet, and it shows the biplanes and the original pilots and so on. And you could buy that at the Bolton Post Office for $12. All right. Now, what's interesting is that they secretly printed 100 sets with the plane flying right side up, and quietly inserted them here and there in different batches to go out to different post offices. All right. So that stimulated the sales of this, obviously, because it's like buying a raffle ticket. All right. So for $12, you might get one of those sheets that would bring in today $50,000 to $70,000. Okay, to get your hands on them. There's that few of those, you might say misprinted, but deliberate stamps, and so that's the kind of prices that I've seen in stamp collecting newspapers for the right side up plane of $2. Okay, they've been recalled from post office sales, but you can contact the U.S. Post Office online and get a set if you want, or some number of sets. There's no limit. Okay, and that's what it looks like. That's the normal sheet for $12, honoring the inversion of the stamp back in 1918. Right, and there's the one that's worth $50,000 and up, if you can find that one. So what a lottery ticket that would be. So my information comes largely from this book, Jenny, by George Amick, a really well done, crafted story with all the excruciating details. Again, this book is great to follow the sales of the stamp over the years, if you're interested in that. A fantastic website has been put together by Siegel Auctions, a very prominent auction house for stamps and coins. It's called invertedjenny.com, and it's very well presented. Has every detail you could ever imagine, all kinds of pictures about the whole story itself. And there's a variety of different brochures and so on for different auctions that occur. It's a very frequent subject in stamp collecting newspapers because everybody's interested in it, and it'll continue to be as people, still seek to get their hands on one of the 100 stamps. So that's the fascinating story. Thank you very much. Thank you.